مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. بضعة أيام وينقضي العام الأول على الحرب التي شنتها روسيا على أوكرانيا، ومع مرور 12 شهرا على حرب سقط فيها مئات الآلاف من القتلى والجرحى وتسببت بنزوح ملايين المدنيين الأوكرانيين، لا يبدو حتى اليوم أن ثمة بوادر جدية لقرب انتهاء الصراع بين روسيا وأوكرانيا. للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا دكتور صموئيل راماني، أستاذ السياسة والعلاقات الدولية في جامعة أوكسفورد. دكتور صموئيل، مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
عام على الحرب الأوكرانية، هل من بوادر جدية لقرب انتهاء الصراع؟
Sadly, no. I think that Russia is obviously trying to embark on a new offensive that will be centered around the Donetsk region. They captured Soledar last month, which was their first major victory in the conflict since the summer when they took over Luhansk. And now they're putting in immense amounts of resources into capturing Bakhmut in the hopes of completing what they call the liberation of Donbass. Obviously, there's some uphill struggles here, but the Russians have really struggled to take over larger cities in Ukraine unless they've completely leveled them to the ground, like we saw in Mariupol. So Sloviansk and Kramatorsk may be a long way towards being captured. But this is their plan. And then once the Russians do have Donbass, if they do win, they certainly are looking towards occupying Zaporizhia in its entirety, and then potentially marching westward to take over recapture Kherson, and then maybe Odessa. On the Ukrainian side, there's a similar commitment towards a longer war. The Ukrainians obviously do not want to make the mistake that they made in 2015, where they signed a peace agreement with Russia that left Russia in control over a substantial portion of their territory. And they believe that the only path to peace in the long run is to get the Russians out entirely. So the Ukrainians are going to want to liberate every inch of their territory, and they're hoping and counting on NATO and Western support to do precisely that. So that's why I think that it's very unlikely we're going to see a resolution to this conflict in the next 6 to 9 months.
كيف تقرأ زيارة الرئيس الأمريكي إلى أوكرانيا؟ وهل بايدن وزيلينسكي على نفس التردد بخصوص مآلات الحرب وطرق التسوية؟
So Biden's personal view is hard to gauge, right? Because he won't speak off the cuff on this an issue of this importance. I think that there are multiple views within the Biden administration. And Biden's obviously, as any president would do, balancing the views of his main advisors. So there's one view that I think is led by Mark Milley and to a lesser extent the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, which is much more focused on engaging in dialogue between Russia and Ukraine. Milley even openly said this to some controversy in the United States, that the only path towards ending this war is negotiated settlement and negotiated solution. So basically this camp would be open to freezing the conflict as soon as Russia is rolled back to the borders of February 24th. So Russia has already been taught a lesson by not gaining anything from this war, and then we can go back to like Minsk 2, make it Minsk 3, and come up with a new ceasefire agreement based on that. There's another camp within the administration, I think, that is represented by the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, which would be a little more hawkish than that. They actually want to see Russia lose territory that they held before this war as a lesson, as a deterrent for further aggression. So they'd be happy to see the Ukrainians take over Donetsk and Luhansk, but they would stop at Crimea. And they would be a little bit concerned about Crimea because they are worried about a Russian nuclear risk or some kind of unpredictable Russian action, that like nuclear weapons use. And Blinken has said that already. He says he's not ruling out supporting Ukraine recapturing Crimea, but he's urging the Ukrainians to think seriously about it and really come to the Americans with a plan that would avoid that. And finally, on the more hawkish end of the spectrum is Victoria Nuland. And Victoria Nuland is supportive of Ukraine entering Crimea and recapturing all of its territory. So I have a feeling that Biden will probably take the middle ground position of Blinken, which is to push the Russians back beyond February 24th and deal them a defeat of some sort, and then go to the bargaining table. So I think that the middle ground position is most likely to occur. And in the meantime, in the short term, obviously, that means a lot of solidarity and a lot of arms to Ukraine. So coming to Kiev, showing support for Zelensky, showing that Ukraine is winning and that they're giving $500 million in additional aid right now is all good, and that would satisfy basically all three camps, I think, of the administration.
هل من الممكن تقييم أداء الطرفين روسيا وأوكرانيا عند هذه المرحلة من الحرب؟ هل تطورت مواقفهما من حيث المجهود الحربي والعتاد؟
I think for the Russians, Obviously, the biggest thing was the inefficacy of their military reforms that they launched after the 2008 Georgian War. So Serdyukov basically reduced the size of the Russian army, hoped to centralize the command structure, and also rely less on conscripts. In fact, what we're seeing is that the command structure was completely dissonant, and they were advancing on 5 or 6 axes of advance without logistics and without supplies. And also, they're now reliant on conscripts much more through mobilization. So, in effect, the Russians have undone their famed military reforms, and Russian military weakness has been shown not just to the Russian public and to the Ukrainians, but to the entire world. And this is a major recalibration. So Russia's goals, even if they admit that their goals are exactly the same as they were a year ago, which they call demilitarization and denazification, in practice are a lot more limited. It's extremely unlikely that the Russians are going to occupy Kiev and replace Zelensky with a pro-Kremlin a politician like Viktor Medvedchuk or Viktor Yanukovych. It's also increasingly unlikely that the Russians are going to be able to gain complete control over the Black Sea and liberate Odessa, Mykolaiv, and get that land bridge to Moldova and Transnistria that they've talked about. Instead, I think their most likely best case scenario, given their munitions constraints and given their strategic deficits, is probably, and also the loss of so many trained soldiers, is to take over Donbass and try to see if they can get something out of the other 2 regions that they've annexed as their territory, Kherson and Zaporizhia. For the Ukrainians, obviously, it's a very different mindset. The Ukrainians have gone from a position where they're trying to protect the existence of their country and trying to avoid a complete defeat to now believing in full victory. And I think resolve and unity inside Ukraine to pursue a full victory is greater than ever before, even if casualties are mounting in Bakhmut and in Donetsk, and even if they may have to lose some territory in Donetsk first, they're thinking about a long, multi-year operation to recapture their territory. And one statistic that's really striking is that if Russia used nuclear weapons, 89% of Ukrainians would want to continue fighting for their freedom. And that's something that I think just underscores the level of resolve and confidence in Ukraine that wasn't there a year ago.
كيف غيرت الأزمة الأوكرانية من خريطة التحالفات العالمية؟ يقول مراقبون إن الحلف الغربي عاجز عن إقناع بقية الدول بخيار الحرب كضرورة.
Well, I think that is very interesting. One of the most striking examples and striking takeaways from this war in Ukraine is just how polarized the international system and the international community has become about this war. When you look at the first 2 votes on condemning Russian aggression, 141 states condemned, the next 140 states condemned. So as you can see, there's very little is changing opinions. Russia's military setbacks are not moving more countries to the Ukrainian side, and Russian war crimes are not necessarily moving more people to the Ukrainian side. And the duration of the war is not making more people become acceptable or willing to stomach Russia's invasion. So that's really what's interesting. And we're seeing a major division, obviously, along Western and non-Western lines. We're seeing the Western countries, with a few countries within NATO, like Hungary, obviously, sometimes wavering on this, generally in support of arming Ukraine, generally in support of stiff sanctions on Russia, and even if it leads to short-term rising food prices, energy prices, inflation, economic pain. And we're seeing the collective non-West basically try to maintain as much of a business-as-usual relationship with Russia as possible, not impose sanctions on Russia. So even if they disagree with the invasion, they don't want to cut off their ties with Russia entirely. And that's a view you're seeing in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, especially, and also from larger countries like China and India, which have become increasingly important partners. But the question is, can China and India really step in and replace the loss of Europe as a market for Russia? Will not sanctioning Russia, not punishing Russia lead to these countries actually investing in Russia and viewing Russia as a partner for their future and risking US secondary sanctions and risking a massive deterioration of relations with America in the process? What we see is that Western resolve and support for Ukraine is very strong, and Chinese and Indian solidarity with Russia is much weaker because they're unwilling to convert their opposition to sanctions into actual investments into Russia as a partner. And that is where Russia will probably struggle in the longer term to really reorient their foreign policy from being tied to Europe and the collective West towards the collective non-West. It's going to have a lot of dislocations economically as it tries to do that.
بما أنك جئت على ذكر الصين، الخطة الصينية لإنهاء النزاع باعتقادك هل الطريق أمامها سالكة؟ هل هناك استعداد للتفاوض بين الطرفين؟
Well, like I said earlier, I think that the nature of the war and the nature of the domestic factions in both countries because you see very hawkish people in Zelensky's camp, like Alexei Danilov, the national security advisor, talk about defeating Russia, dismembering Russia, denuclearizing Russia. You see very similar kinds of hawks in the Russian camp, like Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner Group head, or Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya, who would be open to using tactical nukes and or want a general mobilization of war economy. There's so many polarizations, and there's such a radicalization and extremism on both sides that there's really no prospect of negotiations, I think, between Russia and Ukraine in the near term, regardless of what China says or does. China is coming and trying to present itself as some kind of a middle ground stakeholder here, and its positions are very similar to what is used in other conflicts, like Libya, Syria, conflicts across Africa. So this is nothing new, really, for the Chinese. They want to show that they don't support the Russian invasion per se, because they support the sovereignty of states, but they're also sympathetic to why Russia invaded, right? They're sympathetic to NATO expansion and to because they see that NATO could come in the Asia-Pacific region and encircle them in a similar way. So I think that China is just trying to burnish its reputation as a conflict mediator and as a force for de-escalation, and show that it really has a middle ground position between the Ukrainian point of view and the Russian view. That's why the stories about what came from the U.S. about China providing lethal or non-lethal military assistance to Russia is so problematic for them, because they don't want to be seen as a Russian ally. But I think it's less about actually advancing negotiations forward. It's more about China's reputation and status in the world than about bringing about peace, just because I don't think that there is room for negotiations or scope for them at this time.
الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة حذر من أن العالم قد يكون متجه نحو حرب أوسع. هل تتفق مع طرحه؟
Well, I think that we should be obviously acknowledging the global consequences of this war. When we say wider war, this is a war that has much more significance than just Europe and Ukraine. Obviously, the biggest example is food security, right? The continued brinkmanship on the Black Sea grain export deal is probably going to kill many more people in countries like Sudan or Somalia than will kill inside Ukraine. That's a tragic, either intended or unintended consequence of this war. I am a little more skeptical, however, that this war is actually going to reheat into a conventional conflict fought on multiple theaters. I think that if Russia had succeeded very quickly in Ukraine and recaptured Kiev, and its military was as strong as they believed it to be, they would have tested the Article 5. They would have tested NATO solidarity through an invasion of the Baltic states or through an invasion of Poland and done it. But Russia's weakness and their inability to succeed even inside Ukraine makes it really implausible and that they would advance on other theaters. Obviously, if Russia did decide to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, there would be immense pressure from NATO to get involved more directly because the nuclear radiation could fall out onto neighboring states and because of the precedent that would set. But given the fact that Russia is focusing right now on conscription, mobilizing more troops and sending more manpower on the ground, and is not really converting those nuclear threats into actual real brinkmanship. Even with New START, even with the arms control agreement that they withdrew from yesterday, they're still saying that they could rejoin it if there's some change on the ground in Ukraine inspections. So I think that unless there's a Russian nuclear escalation of some kind, which I think is unlikely, I think we're looking at a conventional war that's fought in Ukraine, but with global consequences, especially for food insecurity and malnutrition in the global south.
بما أنك جئت على ذكر الأزمة الاقتصادية وارتفاع أسعار البنزين وشح المواد الغذائية الأساسية، هل سيتحمل العالم الفقير تبعات الحرب؟
Yeah, it's a very tragic situation, particularly with food, because the Ukraine war is coming right after several major shocks to global food markets. The COVID-19 pandemic, right, severely disrupted supply chains in manufacturing and transportation. Then we saw like natural disasters like the droughts that we're seeing afflicting Somalia and many parts of Eastern Africa, and the locust infestations and other things, followed by the war in Ukraine. So effectively, after at least first decade and a half after the end of the Cold War, consistent progress towards reducing malnutrition, we're now seeing a reversal, not only a reversal of that progress, but a going backward of several decades in many of the most food insecure regions of the world. And the Ukraine war has just made this worse. And the problem is, because of the fact that Russia has weaponized food as a tactic to get sanctions relieved on it, by blockading Ukrainian ports and by continually threatening to scrap the grain deal and withdrawing from it in October, and then only renewing it on a 4-month basis, and then delaying inspections of ships.
إيه، لكن لوم روسيا لا يحل الأزمة. هل من حلول حقيقية؟
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that the first thing that needs to be done is free, unfettered access of grain out of the Black Sea. And that means dealing with all the causes of it, dealing with the Russian blockade, dealing with demining. Landmine investments in the removal of landmines and sea mines on the Black Sea coast is absolutely integral. It's not something that should be timed for the next 10 to 15 years. It's something that should be done even as soon as the war is finished, or even while the war is still going on, to make sure that the food reaches them. Another thing that's important is making sure that the inspections regime is much more rigorously enforced, and that food aid and food supply comes much more frequently than just these symbolic gifts that we're seeing coming to places like Somalia, Sudan, Kenya, and real mobilization at the multilateral level. So in the United Nations, and a recognition on all sides that this is a global problem and this is not a West, non-West divide. The food security crisis has been tied to the broader geopolitical divisions in the world. And that's where the problems are. Unfortunately, I think because of the polarizations, we're not seeing that exactly what you're saying. A lot of blame gaming, a lot of people pointing fingers, but not a lot of solutions. And that's where the problem is.
دكتور صموئيل راماني، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.